I'd like to introduce another dear friend of the center and another Trojan, Port of Long Beach's Deputy Executive Director, Dr. Noel Hacegaba.
Thank you very much, Wink, for that kind introduction, and good morning to all. Hope you're all faring well. I'm going to take a moment here to share my screen. There we go. Did that do the trick, Wink?
Yep, we can see it.
My screen?
Yes, it did.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, again, I want to thank Nick and the team there for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure for us to be able to join you and share what we're seeing from where we sit in the supply chain. And I think the theme that was selected for this year is certainly very timely. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just walk you through what we've seen so far this year, and then get back to the focus of this summit, which I'm very pleased that we've decided to carry forth, even in spite of everything that's happened. Let me begin by saying that, you know, when the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, I knew 2020 was going to be a year to remember. And of course, little did we know at the time that the events that would soon follow would define and shape this truly unprecedented year. But in many ways, what we've all gone through together highlights the importance, the vitalness of the supply chain. In the early months of COVID, it was all about prioritizing, expediting shipments, carrying COVID-19 related supplies, medical supplies, PPE. And now, as we are managing the surge and the rebound, it becomes increasingly important that the supply chain do its part to move goods to where they're needed in the most expeditious way possible. I want to remind all of you, and really this is a slide that I'd like to share with our policymakers at all levels of government, the positive economic impact of goods movement. I often say that you know, the supply chain is the economy in motion, right? Goods movement is the economy in motion. When you look at the jobs generated, the total economic value, the tax revenues that are generated by our collective activity, it's hard to rival that. Here locally in Southern California and in Long Beach, 1 out of 5 jobs is generated by port activity. And 2.6 million jobs across the US. So certainly nothing to sneeze at. And this is why it's important for us to keep in mind the bigger picture as policies are being considered and formed and as decisions are made. And I'll share some examples as I walk you through some of these slides. Let me begin by walking you through our numbers. And this is through August. I was hoping that we'd be in a position to share our September numbers, but we're about a week away, and I'll leave you all in suspense when I get to September. But as you can see, a lot of red. You know, certainly from January through April, we were experiencing double-digit declines, and that was driven primarily from the paralysis of the manufacturing arm in China and across Asia. As the Lunar New Year was extended and the factory closures were extended as a result of COVID, there wasn't a lot of volume that was coming in. And of course, in our gateway, which is largely Trans-Pacific, we felt that in a more significant way than other gateways across the US. Then we had an anomaly in May. We actually saw the first positive volume increase year over year in 8 months. And then in June, we went down by about 11%. But the real story is the impact in the first quarter was primarily driven by the impact to manufacturing in China and across Asia. By the time the virus made its way to the US, with all the health orders that were put in place and we were confined to our homes, unable to visit stores and so forth, even though e-commerce skyrocketed during that time period, consumption and purchases were down. And so that's what we saw in the second quarter. But come June and July, we saw the rebound commence. And July for us at the Port of Long Beach was a record-setting year. That was the busiest month on record to the tune of 21% year over year. And that has continued, right? August was another strong month for us. It ended up being the strongest August on record for us. And September, as I said, is also shaping up to be a very strong month. And by next week, we'll be in a position to release our final numbers. And we believe that this is actually this momentum, which we forecast will continue through the end of the calendar year, will actually land us in positive territory. I mean, as hard as it is to believe, in spite of everything that we saw in the first couple of quarters of this year, the strength of the last half of this year will actually propel us to land in positive territory. So certainly a surprise for us there, a good surprise in many ways. Another factor in this is we saw a slight shift in our top import and export commodities. Generally, we're accustomed to seeing furniture and footwear and apparel, but because of the demand for COVID-related supplies, PPE, we saw an uptick in medical equipment, machinery and parts that were all related to responding to the crisis pandemic here in the U.S. On the export side, we also saw an uptick in chemical compounds, raw materials that are used to manufacture a lot of this medical equipment, machinery and parts, also in response to COVID. Big picture, when you look at the gateways in the U.S. and you compare how we fared during the first couple of quarters, you'll see that every gateway in the U.S. was down, no surprise there. And you'll see that some gateways experienced more declines than others. But that was sort of the story of the first half of the year. And again, the boomerang hit around July when the rebound hit. And one of the things that we're particularly concerned about here in Southern California, in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, is our market share. So even during this time of crisis, we're constantly looking at ways to build on our value proposition and be able to convince and persuade our partners, the BCOs, the customers, why our gateway is superior and the advantages represented therein. But if you look at market share, we've actually lost market share. We've been losing market share for the past 12, 15 years. And right now, in our line of sight and our number one priority as a gateway is to fortify our value proposition, to strengthen it. And again, this pandemic and this crisis, I think, puts us in a position to demonstrate to the industry and to the customer what we're doing and what we will continue to do, not just to regain that lost market share, but to build on that market share and see this gateway truly live up to its potential. So let me talk a little bit about some of the trends that were triggered by COVID and some of the things that we continue to see right now. No surprise, there was a significant spike in blank sailings. These are canceled voyages, ships that were scheduled to come that were canceled. We saw that dramatically increase in the first and second quarters. We also saw less volume transported on larger ships. And of course, the shipping lines were trying to optimize their networks, trying to maximize the efficiencies from their operation. And these were concentrated in fewer calls, creating artificial peaks. And we saw some of that in the first couple of quarters on the inbound side, but primarily on the outbound side with a lot of empty returns that were piling up in our ports, a lot of empty containers that were making their way to our terminals. And there was a lot of relocation that had to be done just as these empties entered our complex. It also had an effect on chassis. Right now, we continue to experience a chassis crunch. The surge right now is putting a stress on our chassis, our ability to meet the chassis demand. That's something that we continue to work with both our chassis providers as well as our terminal operators, ways to flex that model and ways to enhance that, either by repairing out of service chassis, injecting additional assets to the complex, and making sure that our partners on the trucking side also do their part by returning those chassis as soon as possible. So these are some of the trends. Obviously, nothing new here. These are the same trends and the same challenges, the same issues that ports across the U.S. have been wrestling with the last several years. But what's different now is that this pandemic has, in some cases, exacerbated some of these factors, and in other cases, prolonged what we typically see in a normal year. Now, of course, I say a normal year, we haven't had a normal year in the last 5, 6 years, and certainly this year is far from what we would consider a normal year. Let me show you a slide here on the blank sailings. I mentioned a moment ago that in the first quarter we saw 60. That's roughly twice what we normally see for that time of year. In the second quarter, we saw roughly 4 times the number of blank sailings we're accustomed to in the second quarter. So that's a lot of ships that didn't make their way here to our complex. But then when you look at quarters 3 and 4, you see a reversal. You see a drastic reduction in the number of black sailings. In fact, we saw a lot of extra loaders and a lot of what we now call extra loaders. And these are ships that made their way here to support the demand, the growing demand, but also ships that were sent our way just to evacuate a lot of these empty containers that have been piling up in our ports. I want to show you some cool photos here. This is the largest ship to visit one of our terminals, ITS. This is an ONE ship, and it was full, and it came to our Pure GITS terminal in April, the largest to call that terminal. We saw the largest ship to transit the Trans-Pacific here, call it TTI, a 23,000 TU ship. And then in the month of May, we saw an 18,400 TU capacity ship set a new record for North America. They handled 30,744 TU on that one single ship call. I show you these pictures because the effect of this pandemic on port operations was fewer ship calls, more cargo, fewer ships. But you see there that our workforce stepped up, and they really stepped up to be able to handle these volume swings. And this is an example of how we as a supply chain came together, and it demonstrates our resilience here in Southern California, how even in spite of a glut in volume in the first half of the year, and now that resurgence and that rebound, and how we as a port ecosystem, a supply chain, have come together to address these growing needs. And very quickly, I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we did as a port authority. We stood up a business recovery task force. I have the pleasure of leading that. This was something that we stood up in February when we noticed that the virus was spreading across Asia and so forth. We knew it was just a matter of time before it made its way to the United States. So we set up this team internal to the Port of Long Beach to gather and report information, make sure our partners and our customers had the latest real-time information to make real-time decisions. It was also about anticipating any operational issues, whether it involves chassis, empty returns, etc. It was about engaging and mobilizing our supply chain partners to make sure that everyone was doing their part to be able to expedite and prioritize COVID-19 carrying containers. And on the flip side, making sure that empties were being optimized so that they were repositioned where they were needed and where the ship was going to be calling for evacuation. And of course, on the advocacy side, we also were very involved early on when all jurisdictions of government were considering health orders that essentially confined folks to their homes. We were at the table making sure that these health orders exempted supply chain, goods movement, our industry, because we knew it would be critical then. And as it turned out, the rest of the year, it would be critical even now. So a lot of activity, a lot of effort. If you would like to get more information, our website has a page dedicated to COVID. You'll see here on the screen the cover to that page, and you'll find all information related to COVID-19, as well as gate hours, how many vessels are at berth, how many vessels are coming. So all the information that you would need to have in order to make decisions are found on our website. Very quickly, in the months of April and into May, there was a lot of demand for PPE, medical equipment, medical supplies. You'll see here, it's a little dated, but you'll see how many containers we were able to expedite. And that's when the shipping lines, the terminals, the trucking companies, the BCOs, we came together, we identified those containers, and we figured out a way to expedite them, prioritize them through our gateway. I say that because it demonstrates what we're capable of doing when we do collaborate, when we come together and we identify those containers. If we can do that for COVID-19 carrying containers that carried medical supplies, it shows that what we can do for all containers. And I think it's important to recognize, again, the importance of collaboration, the importance of viewing our discrete roles and functions within the broader supply chain as parts of a broader network that has to be integrated and has to work together. On the PPE front, obviously, our dock workers were on the waterfront doing their part. It was important to create a safe work environment for them, ensure that they had the PPE. So we partnered with the Pacific Maritime Association ILWU to make sure that we were doing our part to provide a lot of this desperately needed PPE. And you'll see that we also stood up a testing site that's still ongoing here on the waterfront. To date, we have over 2,000 tests that have been done. It's very accessible and very easy for our frontline workers to access. And again, our part of making sure that we're creating that safe work environment for our partners. On the advocacy side, very quickly, I'm not going to go through this list, but that's just a sampling of the many issues at all levels of government that we're at the table helping to shape and helping to form on the policy side to make sure that goods movement, supply chain, and our industry is considered and is being protected as a lot of these policies and decisions are being made. So let's talk about the future. The year ahead. I mean, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen next. This year has been filled with surprises. And I think all of us would agree that, you know, no crystal ball has ever been perfect, certainly not this year. But when you look at the year ahead and you look at the next 5 years, as is the theme of this summit, it's important to consider the global economy. It's important to consider trade policy that's currently in place. What could come up, what could surface in the years ahead. It's important to consider how the different functions of the supply chain, the different players and actors in the supply chain are responding to the economy, responding to some of these paradigm shifts and changes that this pandemic has in many ways accelerated. Everything from consolidating, optimizing their networks to some of the fuel strategies and vis-a-vis IMO 2020. But there are also a lot of supply chain trends and inventory management practices that have already changed and will continue to evolve in response to this crisis. Very quickly, when you look at the US economy today, obviously no surprise here, a lot of the indicators that historically have demonstrated the overall health of the economy are still in recovery mode. And as you can see there, the interest rates are still at historic lows. The GDP annual growth rate is still in negative territory. But there are some bright spots. When you look at unemployment, for example, you'll see that the unemployment rate for the month of September is almost half of what it was at its peak in April. And that's a good sign for the supply chain because it means that people will continue to consume, to buy. It means that demand for cargo will continue at hopefully at a healthy clip. But you see that on the unemployment side, there's a bright line there and there's some good news. When you look at employment in general, specific to transportation and warehousing, you'll see a reflection of just how busy we are today handling this cargo surge. You'll see that there's growth in the transportation and warehousing sector as it relates to trucks and couriers, you know, last mile logistics, warehousing. And I think that bodes well for the future of our industry as it relates to employment, as it relates to job opportunities going forward. Another metric that we also track, which I think is of interest to all of us, is the ratio between business inventories and sales. You know, this chart is something we track on a monthly basis. It's put out by the US Census Bureau. But when you look at this ratio historically, anytime it starts moving up, it's a sign of concern. And historically, it's been a sign of concern because what that represents is that inventories are piling up either in the warehouse, DC, or on store shelves, and they're not being consumed. We started seeing a shift in that pattern about 7-8 years ago, and that was the advent of e-commerce as BCOs, retailers were now having a position, they were having to have more inventory, position that closer to the end consumer. But what we saw in May, in the months of April and May, for example, that huge blip, that was simply we as consumers not buying as much stuff and inventories piling up. But you'll notice that in the months of June, July, and into August, you'll see that ratio come down again. And that's corresponding to some of the trends we're seeing on the employment side and the overall health of the economy, which we think is a good sign for our industry. Finally, this is something I found on the Wall Street Journal, and it has a headline, How Coronavirus Changed the Retail Landscape. It doesn't say anything that I think most on the call and most on the summit here don't already know. But you know, the glut in consumption that we saw in the months of April and even into May, when the health orders were confining us to our homes, we saw a massive drop in in-store consumption, of course, but then we also saw just a massive uptick in e-commerce, and that has continued. In fact, today, the Commerce Department reports that approximately 14% of all retail purchases are now done online. Just a few years ago, that figure was closer to 8%. So it shows you that seismic shift and how this pandemic has accelerated that shift from in-store to online. And of course, on the in-store side, even on the online side, some sectors have fared better than others. Home improvement and grocery stores obviously continue to have foot traffic in positive territory, but virtually every other sector is down. So what are we doing in the long haul? We think that this pandemic, as grave and as serious as it's been for our industry, and its impact will continue to be felt for years in the future, it's a disruption, right? And our industry is not immune to disruptions. Every year, the past 6-7 years, we've had some form of disruption, whether it's been consolidation, realignment in the shipping line industry, bankruptcies, mergers, acquisitions, whether it's been the U.S. trade war dispute. Every year we've had to wrestle with some form of disruption. We believe here at the Port of Long Beach that this is short term in the sense that it's not going to be something that's going to be felt or seen in the long term. And so that's why we're staying focused and disciplined with our plans. We like to say that in crisis, we continue to build. And so we're building out our capital improvement program to the tune of $4 billion. We're strengthening our abilities of our terminal operators to handle the bigger ships. We have 4 of our 6 container terminals that can handle 14,000 plus TEU ships. And you see our investments, they're all focused on building on that value proposition and our ability, strengthening our ability to handle these massive ships. We're also building our infrastructure by upgrading, rebuilding, replacing. Just last week, we opened up our brand new bridge. We call it the Bridge to Everywhere, which carries 15% of the nation's goods. This bridge is going to help facilitate the commuter and truck traffic, but also allow larger ships to transit into our back channel. And this is going to be a very key and strategic piece of infrastructure for us and for our gateway. And of course, we're in the final phase of our Middle Harbor replacement redevelopment project, which is going to be the most advanced terminal in North America. I mean, the future is certainly bright. And what I want to remind the group here is, you know, we need to keep our eyes on the long term. We need to keep focused on the potential that we can accomplish together. And that's exactly what we're doing, whether it's building out our physical infrastructure, building out our information management infrastructure. We're seeing a lot of innovation, primarily driven by our terminals, for example. Terminals now using APIs that integrate the operating systems of the terminal operations with the trucking company. So we see a lot of innovation that's also aiding this digital transformation that our industry is in the midst of. And so with that, the outlook for 2025, again, we're bullish. We believe that the Southern California Gateway, with all the massive CapEx investments, all the focus on optimizing operations, leveraging technologies, we think the future is bright. We think we have a lot to offer to the customers. We think that all these investments will add value to the Southern California Gateway and the Southern California supply chain. And we're certainly very bullish about the future. And so at this point, I'd like to, just to stay within the time I was given, I'd like to conclude my remarks and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Noel. We do have a question from one of our attendees, Adrian Grenier. What are some of the top current initiatives to better integrate terminal ops with global supply chain metrics? Things like free flow containers, technology, et cetera.
You know, that's a great question, and it's actually a work in progress. I think as we, as an industry, continue to adopt these emerging technologies, it comes down to integration. And an example I can offer you right now is what's happening at Long Beach Container Terminal. They're using APIs today. They've been using them now for the last year and a half. What that does, what these APIs allow this terminal to do, is to directly integrate their operating system, their TOS, with the operating system of the truck drivers, of the dray companies that are employed by the customer. This integration allows the optimization of these functions to be able to have this operation be a little more seamless, requires less time-intensive transactions, whether online, via telephone, et cetera. So I think that's an example of where we eventually see ourselves. I mean, we are an end-to-end supply chain. We continue to operate to a certain degree in silos. And to the extent that we can leverage technology to break those silos and truly have an end-to-end supply chain with a technology platform that connects all of that, I think that's the future. And that's what's going to allow us not just to have visibility, but also be able to apply certain metrics so that we have the ability to assess the manner in which a container makes its voyage from origin all the way to destination.
One more question. What is the port doing to manage emissions and to prepare for electric trucks?
Some of you are aware that in the last couple of years, the two ports in Southern California, LA, Long Beach, we updated our Clean Air Action Plan, and we established goals and targets for a zero emissions future, which calls for zero emissions cargo handling equipment by the year 2030 and zero emissions trucks by the year 2035. And some of you are aware that just in the last few weeks, the governor of California also established a target on the commuter vehicle side, setting a target for 2035. So these are targets. Obviously, those of you who are familiar with the ports in Southern California, you know our resume. You know that we've managed to be able to green our operations and drastically reduce emissions while growing our business. And that will continue to be our business model. At the end of the day, we know what we are. We know what our mission is, but we're going to continue to raise the bar when it comes to our operations. And certainly we're going to continue to rely on all of our partners, whether it's the marine terminal operators, the shipping lines, the trucking companies, to make sure that we continue to grow in a responsible way. So that is something that we're certainly, that's certainly a work in progress. It's something that we're going to continue to collaborate with all of our industry partners, because it's going to take all of us working together to ensure that we meet those targets as established by the Clean Air Action Plan.
Okay, thanks again, Noel. Great presentation.